I'm based at Cefas, which is the fisheries lab belonging to DEFRA down in Lowestoft in England. My co-authors are Angus Garrett from Seafish, the Seafood Industry Authority, Julia Walters and Tara Marshall from University of Aberdeen, Ruth Kelly from AFBI in Northern Ireland, and Martina Stiasny from University of Southampton. And just to sort of try and show how this is different to the presentation that Clive's just given, this is something that Angus and myself put together to represent how climate change affects the sort of UK seafood system, if you like. Mostly what you've just heard about are the blue bits here, whereas this talk that I'm going to give now goes a bit from the dark blue across to just about the sort of brownish bit in the middle. So here we do cover the fish a bit, but also the fleets, the impacts on the ports and harbours, and we get about as far as the logistics and the processing. Clearly, there's an overlap between fish and fisheries in the supporting documents. In terms of the sort of studies that we mostly cover here, it tends to be things that have used fisheries catches or landings data rather than survey data. We cover a lot of things that we get from the fish stock assessments from the from ICs and that sort of process, and also although Clive mentioned cephalopods a little bit, there's a bit more focus here on shellfish as well, including mollusks and crustaceans. One thing that I wanted to focus on particularly just to start this is certainly the fisheries labs at the moment are very busy working on the implementation of the UK Fisheries Act. So this passed Parliament in November 2020, but it does include a climate change objective. So objective H requires that the adverse effect of fish and aquaculture activities on climate change are minimised, and that fish and aquaculture activities adapt to climate change. And then what that really means was clarified in a joint fisheries statement that was released by all of the devolved administrations in November last year. And it includes quite a lot of information about climate change in there, but I just included two of the clauses here. So it says that the national fisheries authorities will continue working to understand and address the impacts of climate change on marine species, habitats and fisheries, as highlighted in the climate change risk assessment. And importantly, that fisheries policy authorities will work in partnership with the seafood sector to support their adaptation. So there are clear policy drivers now that weren't really there the last time that MCCIP reviewed fisheries. Okay. Some of the things that we've noted in our report, and again, we are largely reporting papers and occurrences that have happened since 2020. As Clive says, some cold water species have declined, and a good example of that is Atlantic wolffish, where commercial fisheries catches and bycatch records are showing that wolffish has pretty much disappeared from most of the southern part of the North Sea. It's a cold water species. But by contrast, Atlantic bluefin tuna is now being reported in very large quantities, particularly around Cornwall and the south of Ireland. It's been seen since 2014, but over the last couple of years, very large numbers. And so, for example, there is a tagging program in the UK now, and last year they tagged 1,000 of these within a single year, just based on 25 recreational sport boats. Whether that's due to climate change or whether they're following their prey is not entirely clear, but there is probably a climate angle to it. As Clive said, a lot of the cephalopod species have increased in abundance, and fisheries have responded to that with catches increasing. We've seen geographical spread in a number of particularly warm water squid species all around the UK, and there are new fisheries in the Moray Firth and places like that. In terms of fish recruitment, so the numbers of juveniles entering the exploitable part of the population, we looked at all of the IC stock assessments that are relevant to the UK, and we tried to see whether recruitment, so the numbers of juveniles over the last few years, how that compares to the sort of long-term average going back to about 1980. And in pretty much most of the stocks, recruitment to the population in recent years has been low for most of them, largely as a result of the consecutive warm years. The exception to that are some of the pelagic species, so things like mackerel, North Sea sprat, Irish Sea herring, blue whiting, and some warm water species where recruitment has been above average. And then there's a few papers out there looking at how that ripples its way through to future projections of maximum sustainable yield. And they've shown that maximum sustainable yield across the North Atlantic has generally decreased in many populations by about 4%, and then in 5 ecoregions, including those around the UK, the yield is actually eroding at a much faster rate of between 15 and 35%. So what that's saying is that what used to be considered sustainable in terms of levels of exploitation in the past might not be sustainable in the future, that we might have to readjust what we think we can take from the populations. Heat waves and cold spells. This has been a very hot topic over the last few months, really, but we have got a section in this report. Several studies have documented episodic shocks, both heat waves and cold spells. It's important to note that we've always had occasional heat waves and cold spells, but what we're interested in is whether they're getting more or less frequent. In the North Sea, commercial catches of sole and sea bass typically increase following a cold spell, although there's immediate mortality in some cases, whereas red mullet and edible crab decrease. But the impacts of heat waves, which was a lot in the press this summer, is actually much less clear. And in terms of the actual impacts on fisheries landings and catches, we detected a sort of a 5-year lag in some sort of records, but that could be largely spurious. It's such a weak relationship. And it's important to say that heat waves, as they're currently defined, at 5 days of above average seawater temperature. We've had heat waves in 1998, 2002, 2003, 2006, 2007, and every year between 2014 to 2019. So heat waves are becoming much more commonplace in 1 month or another each year. And so, not surprisingly, it's difficult to detect the impact of an individual heat wave on fish catches when what we're really seeing is largely a trend. Actually, there was a very recent paper that came out looking all across the world at marine heat waves, and they also showed that it was quite difficult to detect the impact on fish communities and fish biomass of heat waves, and that often it's very difficult to distinguish those from natural and sort of sampling variability. So you might expect to see impacts of heat waves, but certainly in terms of impacts on commercial fish landings, it's very difficult to do so. Extreme weather and impacts on the fishery operations. Fishing remains the most dangerous occupation in the UK. The fatal accident rate is about 115 times higher than a general office job. There's been a number of studies that came out over the last year. I was involved in a project where we interviewed fishermen all around Cornwall and how they respond to storminess, and that showed that fishers generally preferred increased wind speed up to certain thresholds, after which they became increasingly averse. But that sort of relationship between when to go to sea or not to go to sea is governed by the size of the vessel, how indebted the owner is, all sorts of factors, the previous profits, things like that. And so there's a lot of things that can determine whether or not a fisherman decides to go to sea, and therefore whether or not fishing is disrupted by storminess. There were similar studies came out in a paper by Watson et al. For small under 10 metre vessels targeting sea bass, particularly those based in Wales, that showed similar patterns. It's important to say that Storm Arwen happened in November 2021, and that led to sinking of a few fishing vessels, particularly in Northumberland and in Scotland. And so it is important to understand the impacts of extreme weather. A few years ago, we interviewed fishermen about climate change in general, and they were much more worried about any future changes in storminess than they were about changes in the temperature, which they felt they could adapt to. Okay, so what can happen in the future? As Clive said, there's been quite a big expansion in the numbers of projection studies out there. One of them that came out very recently is by Townhill et al. That looked at whether or not the UK EEZ is likely to become more or less suitable for 49 commercial species. It was carried out largely in the context of the UK Brexit negotiations, and they did use an ensemble of models and 3 different climate scenarios. And so that's why on this plot you can see that the bars have error margins around them. And what they showed that about half of the species that they looked at, the UK was going to get actually better for, and half of the species it's probably going to get worse for. But in some cases, the error bars span across the red line, which suggests that you can't really tell whether it's going to get better or worse. But some of the species that are projected, the UK seas are going to get better for, things like black sea bream, sea bass, pilchard or sardine, red mullet, anchovy, some of the ones Clive's already talked about. But some of those at the bottom, where all of the models consistently said that it was going to get worse, were things like wolffish, which we're already seeing, halibut, saithe, megrim. Some of our more traditional species, cod kind of spanned 0, but most of the models suggest it was going to get slightly worse for. Ocean acidification, as I say, the fisheries report does include a bit more information on shellfish, not just cephalopods, but also mollusks and crustaceans. The evidence is very contradictory, really. 2 studies, both from the same institute, give pretty much opposite projections here. So Mangi et al. Gave economic projections for potential losses due to impacts on shellfish production of ocean acidification, and suggested between 14 and 28% reductions in the net present value. However, when Townhill et al. Looked at the actual projections of what pH conditions we might actually see around the UK in the next 50 to 100 years, they showed that actually there are very few places around the UK where pH will get so low that it will impact the shellfish as determined in the experiments that have been carried out. So in other words, people are tending to be carried out experiments at fairly high CO2 or low pH conditions, and the waters around the UK are not really projected to reach those levels until way beyond 2100. There was a little spot south of Ireland where the nephrops fisheries occur, where there may be some reduction, but not sort of catastrophic levels. So at pH minima observed in the model outputs at the end of century experiments, even at RCP 8.5, the extreme scenario, most species seem to be robust. Finally, we featured in the report a climate change risk assessment that was carried out as part of an EU project called Ceres, where 380 fishing fleets and 105 coastal regions of Europe were ranked in terms of their relative risk to climate change in the future. So for every one of those fleets or regions, scores were allocated for hazard, exposure and vulnerability. And when you add those 3 components together, you get a score for risk. And what that noted is that some of those fleets and regions in the north of England and the south of Scotland were amongst the most at risk to climate change of any in Europe. So they show up as yellow on this map here. And that's largely because some of the species that are targeted are particularly sensitive. Also, some of the fisheries tend to be relatively restricted in the species that are being, so rather than taking a portfolio of species, they concentrate on one species. But it's also important to note that in the UK included both some of the most robust fisheries in Europe and some of the most sensitive. So Northern Scotland was actually one of the most robust regions across the whole of Europe, whereas North of England was some of the lowest. So you get both high risk and low risk even within the same country. And I think that's my last slide.